Hey everyone, I just played Five Nights at Freddy's, and can you believe this game is almost 10 years old? I can't. The last time I checked in on the series in 2015 there were 4 indie horror titles, but now there's 9 main games, 7 spin-offs, a trilogy of books, about 7 billion graphic novels, even a feature film scheduled to release around Halloween this year, and that's not even getting into all the fan content floating around in all its myriad forms. It's a media juggernaut, if not the earliest example of mascot horror, then certainly the most successful. Probably the most successful example of analog horror too, and its story is a triumph of independent game development. But I'm not really here to talk about all that. As the franchise continues to grow, as each entry reinvents or expands the mechanics and the lore, as the original release fades further and further into the past, it becomes easier and easier to lose sight of what made that first Five Nights at Freddy's so captivating when it came out back in 2014, so I'm going to talk about it. But before I get my hands into the guts of this game, there are going to be a lot of flashing lights in this video. There wasn't really any way for me to edit around it this time, so feel free to listen to this video if you need to. Okay, let's get to it. It's kind of impossible to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's without talking about the man who made it, and the circumstances which led him to do so. 10 years ago, Scott was a largely unknown indie developer whose work mostly consisted of Christian games like Pilgrim's Progress and The Desolate Hope, but his first big flash of fame in the gaming zeitgeist came in 2013, when Chipper & Sons Lumber Co. was submitted to Steam Greenlight. People who looked at the game, both professionals like Stephanie Sterling and casual Steam users, criticised the game's art style for being unintentional but undeniable nightmare fuel, unsuitable for a family-friendly title. By all accounts, the reaction, along with the lack of success his previous games had received, was devastating to Cawthon. But over time he was able to recover from the blow, take the criticism on the chin, and use it to create something that was not only intentionally terrifying, but financially successful, thanks in no small part to Five Nights at Freddy's release coinciding with the Let's Play indie horror boom of the early to mid-2010s. The exposure Markiplier's videos alone gave the game is something marketing departments at billion-dollar companies could only dream of at the time. That exposure and word of mouth led to sales, and now, almost a decade later, here we are. I remember watching those early Let's Plays too, and I remember how different Five Nights at Freddy's felt to all the indie horror shovelware titles that YouTubers like Markiplier had to play in order to manage daily uploads. It was more than just an asset flip or another Slenderman fan game. It had actual effort and talent put into it, at least by comparison to those shovelware titles. Videos on which you only really watched to see your Let's Player of choice overreact to a mediocre jump scare. Five Nights at Freddy's was the rare game that left you wanting more at the end of the video, but those memories were only really unlocked for me during the making of this critique. When I first sat down to make the video, I had long ago tossed Five Nights at Freddy's into the same bin as those shovelware games, a title that is more fun to watch other people play than it is to experience yourself. So you buy it, and you play it for maybe an hour, and then you never touch it again, but the developer still makes bank because enough people are inspired by content creators to give it a go themselves. I was wrong in that assumption. Five Nights at Freddy's greatest strength is that it adheres to the principle of keep it simple stupid, or KISS. In fact, that's what the animatronics are doing when they rush in for a jump scare, just giving you a little smooch, mwah, before they drag you off to stuff you into a spare Freddy suit. That simplicity is why it's such an effective horror title. I've consumed a lot of horror media over the years, and more often than not, the best scares come from the simplest things. You don't need some grand mythology full of answers to questions no one asked. All it takes is something familiar, twisted into something unknowable. A lot of praise is always given to the designs of Freddy and his entourage for capturing the uncanny valley nature of old fast food franchise animatronics like Chuck E. Cheese, which do indeed take something familiar and turn it into something horrifying, but I think Freddy Fazbear's itself is just as big a part of the horror. Fast food joints like the eponymous pizzeria are already strange enough late at night when the lights are off and the doors are locked. As spaces, they're meant to be brightly lit and full of noise and people. Without that human presence, they take on a haunted quality, and I think everyone has had at least one experience in life where you found yourself alone in a place like that. We all know how deafening that nighttime silence can be. We've all seen how darkness and shadows can warp familiar spaces. It can be easy to get turned around even when you know the space well by the light of day, which is something I think Five Nights at Freddy's captures really well in the layout of the pizzeria. If you look at the floor plan in the corner of the monitor, it's just a normal building. There's the food court and a couple of stages out the front, some bathrooms and the kitchens off to the right, a cleaning closet and the animatronics workshop off to the left, clothesline out the back, veranda out the front, and your office hidden away at the back of the building at the end of a pair of hallways. But none of the 11 security cameras give you the sense of that normal space. They show each room from different angles to get you turned around. They move from side to side to hide parts of the area from view. And some rooms of the building are so dark that it's hard to make out anything through the static. Is that an animatronic wandering down the hall, or just a shadow on the wall? Sometimes they just stop working entirely, which becomes a lot more nerve-wracking once you realise that means the animatronics are on the move. On rare occasions, they even change, just like liminal spaces seem to do in real life. They are, in essence, terrible security cameras, but they are also perfect fixed camera angles for a survival horror game. The use of lighting, shadows, static, and muted colours only add to the atmosphere, and that's all before Freddy and the gang even climb off the stage. It creates such a contrast with your office, which, while not brightly lit, is certainly warmer in colour and tone compared to the rest of the pizzeria. It's not a safe place by any means. The open doors allow Freddy, Chica, Bonnie, and Foxy easy access to the office, and when the lights drop out here, that's when you know the shit's really about to hit the fan. But it's certainly less of a liminal space than the rest of the pizzeria. The drawings on the wall just look like drawings instead of the nightmare fuel you can see on the cameras hung up around the building. You've got your fan friend. The cupcake's just happy to be here. Plus, you can do this. I wouldn't recommend it though, it might draw them closer. What even is there for me to say about the animatronics that hasn't already been said? Their designs are kind of perfect, just the right mix of mundane and uncanny, without any of the more extravagant flourishes the sequels would introduce, like missing parts, rotting flesh, and nightmare teeth. From the right angles, they're not even all that disturbing, but in the wrong pose with the wrong lighting, they suddenly become a lot more threatening. Five Nights at Freddy's is a game with very little animation, but the poses these things strike don't need it to convey their slow lumbering gaits or awkward staccato movements. The way Chica lolls her head from side to side, the way Bonnie walks, the way Freddy hides in the darkness, it's great. If anything, what little animation there is breaks the sense of dread the game tries so hard to build, not because it's necessarily bad, but because you create such a vivid idea of how these things move in your own head through the still images on the security cameras that any actual glimpse of movement can never live up to it, which I think is why the animations are almost entirely saved for the jump scares. The movement is meant to startle a player accustomed to still images, or induce panic in the event you see Foxy racing down the hallway to get you. The way they're almost always looking directly down the barrel of the security cameras creates the sense that they're watching you just as much as you're watching them. The sound design does a lot of heavy lifting for Five Nights at Freddy's atmosphere too, a lot more than I originally realised when watching Let's Plays of the game 9 years ago. The constant electric hum of the fan in your office, and the analogue scratch of the static in the security cameras creates such a grim mood, and help mask the noises of the animatronics as they move around the building. Their distant footsteps always had me rushing through each of the cameras to see who had moved, and to where, and their occasional humming never failed to remind me of just how close they always were. In some ways, whenever Freddy or Chica moved into the kitchen, it was a relief, because I could hear them rattling around and always knew where they were as long as the sound continued. It's when everything went quiet again that the real dread set in, and there's never a moment that is truer than when the power goes out. You wouldn't think the constant drone of the fan would be much of a comfort given the situation, but it is, because as long as you can hear it, you know the power's still on, and you still have a chance of surviving the night. The dead silence after the power goes out is worse than the jump scare that usually follows, just because the moment serves to ratchet up the tension as high as it can go. The fact that Freddy always waits a different amount of time before grabbing you only adds to that. It's really well done for a jump scare. The game doesn't have much music, but like its animations, it knows how to use what little there is well. The little scare chord that plays whenever Bonnie or Chica appear at the doors to your office is just the right amount of musical accompaniment for the moment. So many jump scares in games and movies overdo it in terms of audio to make up for how mediocre they are visually, including Five Nights at Freddy's own sequels, but here it's perfectly balanced, as all things should be. The arcade jingles only serve to mask the movement of the animatronics, and the music box opera cover that plays whenever Freddy's on the hunt is great too, because as I've already mentioned, you'll never know how long he's going to play it before he... The rest of the sound design is fine. There are one or two stock effects in there, but Freddy's laughter whenever he moves more than makes up for children cheering .wav. And as for the voice acting, it's fine. The game's presentation comes together to create an atmosphere that is genuinely, surprisingly unsettling. The same sort of unnerving mood you get whenever you see a spider on a wall, look away for a moment, and then turn back to find that it's gone. As a result of having consumed so much horror media over the years, I feel like I've become desensitized to most of it. I still usually find the horror elements engaging, but it's more in a technical how are they going to put their own spin on things kind of way than in a I'm terrified but I can't look away kind of way. Given I was there back when Five Nights at Freddy's was fresh and new, and had already seen everything the game could throw at me through Markiplier's Let's Plays all those years ago, I figured I would feel the same way here. But early on, I actually found myself kind of unnerved. The game actually managed to get its hooks into me. I started wasting power checking different rooms, even though I knew the animatronics hadn't moved, because I needed to be sure those hallways were still empty. I didn't want the things any closer to me than they already were. I know, I almost can't believe it. That said, the last game that got under my skin the same way was Alyssa, which was also a horror title about creepy animatronics, so maybe that's just my weakness. All that said, it was only really Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy that got to me. Freddy just isn't that scary when he's not hiding in the darkness, and I don't find his design as uncanny valley as the others. I don't think I could after getting scarred for life by this fucking thing as a kid. Compared to the bear with the brown fuzzy hair, Freddy is practically Sweet Dreams fuel.
I'm the bear, and I'm coming!
I think one of the bigger reasons behind the game's effective horror elements is that they're intended for a general audience. You can practically trace the trajectory of the franchise's move from genuinely scary to merely aesthetically spooky on a graph as the intended audience for each entry skews younger and younger. Come Security Breach and most of the designs are almost cartoony, which isn't a criticism at all. Aside from Five Nights at Freddy's 2, it's the only one I have any interest in playing, and I can't even judge because when I was that young, I was also consuming horror media definitely not intended for me. Though the people making it also never started creating content specifically for people my age either. But the decision to market to a younger demographic does mean a little of the franchise's original horror cred has been lost over time, something I retroactively applied to this first entry, perhaps to my own detriment. I came in expecting a shovelware cartoon, and got something genuinely unsettling instead. If I have any criticisms of the game's presentation, it's these random hallucinations. They're just not very scary, and all they do is get in the way. I also think the main menu is a bit plain and amateur. There isn't even a quit button, you have to exit the game by pressing escape, but it's such a small part of the experience that it doesn't detract much. So to answer the thumbnail, yes, Five Nights at Freddy's is still a little scary, although it doesn't stay that way. As with anything horror related, exposure reduces its effectiveness, and as soon as you run up against the difficulty curve, all the scares go right out the window, because underneath the presentation, Five Nights at Freddy's is just a resource management game. Like with the presentation, the game's handful of mechanics are simple but elegant in their execution. You can light up the hallways to either side of your office, and close the doors if need be, at the cost of your very limited power supply, or you can check on the 11 security cameras positioned around the pizzeria. The more things you activate, the faster your power drains. Use up the juice completely and you're pretty much dead, unless it's already past 5 AM and Freddy's feeling merciful. Satisfying as it is to see that 6 AM pop up right as Freddy's winding up for his coup de grace, it's always made me wonder, like, what makes him stop? Is he just off the clock at 6 AM? Well, sun's up, better get back on stage for the day shift. Anyway, it seems like a lot to cover at first, especially with so little power to work with, and it is very easy to get overwhelmed by the game's horror elements early on. But once you get over that hurdle and start engaging with Five Nights at Freddy's as a game, instead of something scary, it becomes very simple, and it won't take long. By the end of Night 3, I was more frustrated with the animatronics than frightened of them, so let's talk about how they work. Bonnie might be the creepiest of the five, but he's actually the easiest to avoid, which makes sense given he's the first one to activate on Night 1. He sticks to the left of the pizzeria, but you don't even really have to keep an eye on him. The biggest surprise he has in store for the player is a mild startle when he appears at the door, but as long as you check the hallway light now and then, he'll never get the drop on you. He was the only animatronic I actually encountered who never got his claws on me. I found Chica to be way more aggressive than Bonnie as the game went on. There were some nights where Chica got to the door multiple times before Bonnie even left the stage. Chica keeps to the right side of the building, so you'll always have some idea of where she is, but unlike Bonnie, it is worth watching her position through the security cameras, or at least taking the care to make sure she's not at 4B, the camera directly outside the east door. If she's there, great, that means she's not at the door. If she isn't, you can always check the hallway light to make sure she's not trying to swoosh in for a jump scare. Once you learn how to avoid them, Bonnie and Chica are basically non-events unless they show up together, which can happen on higher difficulty modes, but on their own, they do have one trick left up their sleeves. Fail to notice them fast enough and they can jam the buttons on their side of the building, which is basically a death sentence. The occasional delay on the lights is already frustrating enough, but once this happens, you might as well restart. You're not making it through the rest of the night. At least if they catch you off guard and you accidentally look at the cameras instead of shutting the door, it's not an instant game over, not even in 420 mode. If you're quick enough to drop If you're quick enough to drop the screen and shut the door, you'll be fine. But if not, and they jam the buttons, the next time you raise the security monitor, it's a guaranteed jump scare, which is how Chica got me the one time she managed to get into the office. And if you don't do anything, Foxy's just going to show up to plunder your booty. That's because Foxy will only activate if you don't stop to check the camera every now and then. The game leads you to believe you have to check his camera specifically because he's shy, but any will serve to hold him back an extra moment. The pros only bother to check in on him specifically once he fully emerges from the curtain, because it's the only way to know when he's rushing the office. Flip through the cameras too quickly and you're just as likely to activate him accidentally, and once he starts that sprint down the port hallway, you've got maybe 5 seconds before he's in your face and screaming. It is possible to shut the door in his face, and it is very satisfying, but it comes at the cost of a huge dump of power, so it's better to try and keep him from making the run at all. Of all the animatronics, Foxy was the second most dangerous after Freddy. He got me 3 times, and I hate him for it. Despite his status as the title character, Freddy Fazbear himself only ever got me 4 times, and only when the power ran out. He never managed to get into the office because ironically, he is the easiest to avoid. There is a measure of luck needed to keep ahead of Bonnie and Chica, and to outfox Foxy, especially on nights 5 through 7 at their most brutal. But Freddy is stupidly simple to escape. You'll always know when when he moves because he laughs. And if you've got a good eye, you'll probably catch him watching you from the shadows. But none of that really matters. It's just more of the presentation trying to trip you up with your own panic. Like Chica, he only comes down the right side of the building, so if he's at camera 4B, just don't check any of the others without shutting the door first. There, done. He'll never get you from that direction. When the power runs out, he'll have to wander all the way around the building to get to the left side door, and those are a few seconds he's never getting back. You stole them from him. They're yours forever. If anything, the way he camps camera 4B on nights 5, 6, and 7 is a big help to the player, because if he's there, you know Chica's either at the door or elsewhere in the pizzeria. The game suggests that playing dead, or staying still, when Freddy shows up once the power dies might trick him into leaving you alone, but that's wrong, it doesn't do anything. Nor does spamming the poster honk, but at least it asserts dominance. Get clowned on, idiot. I never even saw Golden Freddy in regular gameplay, and I looked. I set all 4 animatronics to 0 on custom night, and spent the whole thing cycling camera 2B, trying to get the poster to change, but it never did. The only glimpse of him I got was when I set custom night to 1987, and that's really not the same thing. That said, if you're lucky enough to find him in the office with you, all you need to do to get rid of him is to flip up the cameras again. I never saw the endoskeleton who can pop up randomly either, but it's cool that he's there. He's not even a threat, he's just chilling somewhere. Getting back to that measure of luck needed to stay safe from Bonnie and Chica, I normally dislike random elements in games, but each night is only 10 minutes or so long, and during the early game, it all combines with the presentation to create that unsettling horror experience. You need the sense that these things can think and are out to get you, because otherwise you start to realize that most of the game is just this. At least on the early nights. It's that randomness that really got to me, that led me to try and close both doors and wait out the rest of the night at 5 AM for 1 or 2 attempts, even though it never worked. That randomness can even save your life, like I've already mentioned, if the power goes out and Freddy holds back long enough for the clock to tick over to 6. But on later nights, it can absolutely suck. If Bonnie or Chica decide to camp their door, or show up together, or both, you can lose a huge percentage of power before the night has even really started. Five Nights at Freddy's kept me engaged as a horror game until night 4. Then it became a matter of winning, and I turned to strategies used by the pros to get myself through it. Here's the one that got me through the rest of the game. Check the left hallway light, check camera 4B, and repeat until the night is over. Using the camera after every check of the hallway will be enough to hold Foxy and Freddy in place the whole night if you're fast enough. I think it's called camera stalling by the community, and as a strategy it served me well. If Bonnie or Chica show up at the doors, take it as an opportunity to check in on Foxy. If it looks like he's about to charge, just make sure to look in on him every few cycles. All that really matters is keeping eyes on Freddy while locking Bonnie and Chica out. Night 4 took a couple of attempts, but night 5 was one and done. I completed it first try. Finishing the 5th night gives you a nice little star on the main menu and unlocks night 6, which is even harder, and it was. Even with the pro strats, it took a few attempts, but it was doable. That netted me a 2nd star and unlocked custom night, where you're free to set the AI of each robot to any number between 0 and 20. Setting them all to 0 gave me a better look around to the pizzeria without the stress of having to manage the robots, and I've already mentioned what happens if you set them to 1, 9, 8, and 7, but putting them all to 20 for the ultimate test of gamer cred is generally considered how you're meant to play custom night. Now, I remember how much of a challenge the 420 mode of custom night used to be, back before people really understood how the game worked, and a few updates that I think changed the balance. I remember watching Markiplier and the Completionist bash their heads against it for hours, to no success, and how much of an achievement it was for them to actually complete. And back then, it was a genuine achievement. But these days, the management aspect of the gameplay mechanics have basically been solved. The only variables left are luck with Bonnie and Chica, and timing on the part of the player, which makes 420 mode more of a question of when, rather than if. I gave myself 10 attempts, expecting it to be a nightmare like it was back in 2014, but I got it on the 5th try. I did so well well thanks to the pro strats that Foxy never even left Pirate's Cove, and I guarantee if anyone watching has never been able to do it, you definitely can with the right game plan and enough perseverance. It's just not very exciting to watch, and it certainly isn't scary. In fact, the game will never be scary again. All of the horror will have drained out by the time you finish 420 mode, and you'll be too good at it to find any repeat playthroughs all that engaging either. At least you get a third star for your troubles. The gameplay mechanics weren't the only thing people were desperate to solve when Five Nights at Freddy's first released. Its cryptic plot was just as much a selling point for a lot of people, if not more so. These days, the overarching plot of Five Nights at Freddy's has become a tangled knot of lost souls, serial killers, and robots, revealed through numerous non-linear time periods. But there's almost none of that in the first game. You're just a security guard, Mike Schmidt, looking to make a quick buck in the 1990s. There's still a bunch of cryptic lore that the series is known for here, but it's nowhere near as convoluted as later entries would make it, and it's not even that hard to find. Sometimes the poster in Camera 4B will change, and reveal a little nugget of lore regarding the murder of several children on the premises, whose bodies were never found, or the way some patrons have noticed blood and mucus around the eyes and mouths of the animatronics, or how the pizzeria is struggling financially to such an extent that it's not expected to survive the year, to say nothing of the now infamous Bite of 87, first mentioned by Phone Guy, but they're all just background elements presented to the player in pieces so they can put the full puzzle together on their own in whatever arrangement they like. There are few definitive answers here, and that's a good thing. The more you explain a monster, the less frightening it becomes, and that's not what you want in a horror game. Most of what story is there comes from Phone Guy, who I'm sure has a name and a backstory these days, but to me he'll always be Phone Guy, who leaves messages for Mike each night. His nightly monologues add a bit of tongue-in-cheek levity to the game, employing more of an ironic corporate horror attitude, where he swings wildly between parroting the company's official statements and letting slip the true nature of things in moments of burnout. Him saying on the first night,
the animatronic characters here do get a bit quirky at night.
And then going on to disingenuously commiserate with the robots, juxtaposes perfectly with his later statement of,
Yeah, they don't tell you these things when you sign up.
After describing how you'll die if Freddy catches you. Phone Guy's jaded worker personality right up to the moment he gets stuffed into an empty Freddy suit on night 4 also does a great job in helping create a sense of verisimilitude as to why so many things about the pizzeria are the way they are. Fazbear Entertainment as a company is a pile of garbage that cuts corners wherever it can in order to survive. Accidents with the animatronics? Yeah, just lock them up on stage during the day and let them wander around at night to keep their robotics working. Losing money? Just turn the power off at night and run some shitty diesel generator to keep the security office lights on. The cameras are covered in static? Well, we're not replacing the tapes. After all those lawsuits, do you think we're made of money? Very little is actually said about them in the game, but what is there creates such a vivid picture of a company that is either ignorant of the monsters their own mascots have become, or criminally negligent by allowing them to remain active for the sake of their bottom line. You just know the pizza here is absolute crap too. God, I can almost taste it. As previously mentioned, Phone Guy gets taken out on night 4, leaving Mike pretty much alone to survive nights 5 to 7. Getting through night 5 nets you a paycheck for a crisp $120. Night 6 gets you an extra 50 cents of overtime, and night 7 gets you the sack. Honestly, that's probably a bigger bonus than any amount of money the company could have been convinced to give up. Overall, the game's simple yet oblique plot laid the perfect foundation for the convoluted mess that was to be built upon it in later entries, but in and of itself, it's perfectly fine as is. Mike Schmidt acts as such a blank slate that you as the player are able to slip into his shoes with ease. Phone Guy provides some level of comfort early on just by virtue of being another human voice, even if he is dead by the time the game starts. Fazbear Entertainment stands as an insurmountable corporate entity no one employee could ever hope to change, done in by their own ignorance or negligence or both, rather than any heroics on Mike's part. And the animatronics step into the role of the mysterious monster with gusto. Everything else is just there to stoke the fires of your own imagination. And for a horror game, that ambiguity is just, mwah, chef's kiss. It did such a good job that this sort of cryptic storytelling is not only a staple of indie horror now, but an expected part of the experience. 2022's Iron Lung had to patch in lore post-release after so many players questioned the developer about its absence, and I completely understand why. It's a very engaging way to tell a story, one that keeps the community fired up and guessing between releases, and sometimes long after a series ends. When done well, it can elevate a story from set dressing to something genuinely special, and while I don't think Five Nights at Freddy's quite reaches those heights here, it's still a decent yarn with a good hook. So, how well does Five Nights at Freddy's hold up as a horror experience in terms of atmosphere and art design and sound design? Pretty well. Take that away and the game underneath is just alright. But it was never just a game, was it? It was a phenomenon, a community, a dialogue between creator and audience. It's still decent enough that it probably would have done well even without the Let's Players, lore goblins, and fan creators shining such a huge spotlight on it. But they did, and the subsequent why can't I say subsequent growth? Subsequent growth, and the subsequent growth and the resultant growth both experienced is very much a part of the Five Nights at Freddy's story. I've already mentioned how it came out at just the right time during the Let's Play indie horror boom on YouTube, but it was also one of the first franchises to ride that early wave of lore explanation videos, which have since become a genre all of their own. The relationship between creator and community at the franchise's height was symbiotic. The first game left everyone wanting more, so Scott Cawthon rushed to make a sequel, and that led to more attention, more discourse, more engagement, which led to more sequels, and on it went until now here we are. There was a lot of criticism thrown at him for pushing so many sequels out the door so quickly in 2014 and 2015, but I understand why he did, given how quickly something like Five Nights at Freddy's can vanish from the zeitgeist, even if you're only doing it for the art. Attention might not put money in your bank account or food on your plate, but damn does it feel good to know what you put out there is consumed and appreciated. When he got his shot in the spotlight, he stepped up to engage with his audience, posting cryptic hints about future games and series deep lore that only helped fuel the fires of the community. And by all accounts, he's been a very nice, very gracious man about his success, which is probably why so many in the Five Nights at Freddy's community felt betrayed when it came to light in 2021 that Scott Cawthon had donated thousands of dollars to people who, in my opinion, were born of pus from a perforated perineum abscess. People who were doing awful things at the time of Scott's donations, and have only gone on to do and inspire further even more awful things since. Scott Cawthon may not have done any of those things personally, but his political donations to the people who are doing them is implicit support of the things themselves, regardless of what he said in his non-apology where he hid behind his wife. It's not like his views were that much of a secret. The guy cut his teeth making Christian games like I mentioned at the start of the video, but donating large amounts of money to people like Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell is a significant step up from just holding a certain belief. And given how many members of the Five Nights at Freddy's community were LGBTQIA+, if that isn't a textbook case of shitting where you eat, I don't know what is. But whatever. I'm sure Melania's hairstylist appreciated Scott's donation. Around the time of that non-apology, Cawthon announced he would be stepping away from the spotlight when it came to managing the Five Nights at Freddy's brand. And you know what? Good. Even if his political donations hadn't come to light, I feel like he had long exhausted his creativity when it came to the franchise. It needed new blood to make it fresh. Some steel wool to scour off the rust, rust and make the franchise shine, if you will. But either way, it certainly tainted his legacy in my eyes. While playing the game, getting through 420 mode on night 7, I was left wanting more. I was so ready to jump into Five Nights at Freddy's 2, to get stuck into the lore and the deeper mechanics, and rage at its 1020 mode. But then I would remember the kind of person Scott Cawthon is, and that excitement would wither away to nothing. Five Nights at Freddy's might hold up well as a horror experience, and okay as a game, but as for its place as the foundational work in one of the biggest franchises of the last decade, the action of its creator have left it just a bit rotten under the floorboards. Not that that means much at this point. Regardless of its actual quality, I'm sure the Five Nights at Freddy's movie is going to rake in millions when it releases come Halloween. Scott Cawthon's fears of getting cancelled never came to pass, and even if they had, the continued financial success of Five Nights at Freddy's means he and his family are set for life. It's so much bigger than a bunch of indie horror games with a dedicated community of Let's Players, lore detectives, and fan creators now. Much more corporate than the simple back and forth between artist and audience it once was. It was nice to look back at that moment in time, when no one knew what Five Nights at Freddy's was, or how big it would get, when it was just a success story of an artist taking harsh criticism and turning it into a great strength, when it wasn't buried under too many mechanics, or bogged down by such a convoluted plot, or diluted from the horror experience it originally aspired to be. There is beauty in its simplicity. It's just a shame it's been tarnished by all that came after. And that's it. I was going to start this outro doing a Markiplier impression for old time's sake, but after 90 minutes of recording, I can't. So there. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did and you want to support the channel, please like, subscribe, comment, and share the video around. It helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate it. I'll be back in September for the next video. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching.